When you think about the 1960s, one of the areas that you probably think of that we haven't talked about yet is the hippies. Another name for the hippies is the counterculture. And even though you may not have heard it called the counterculture, this is what we often refer to it as. These are a group of nonconformists, meaning they don't go along with the rest of the crowd. A professor by the name of Timothy Leary was a proponent of drug use. His slogan was tune in, turn on, and drop out. He was talking about specifically using acid. He believed that drug use would allow your mind to experience reality in a higher level, that you would be able to go places you wouldn't have been able to go without the use of those drugs. Hippies are known for various things. One is the type of music they listen to, rock music. A lot of this influences music for generations to come. They had a very radical appearance. Whereas if you remember in the 1950s, everyone dressed very neatly. Girls dressed neatly wearing dresses. Guys wore slacks and shirts and ties and had short hair. This was not the case in the 1960s. The clothing was very different. We had guys who had long hair. Girls had long hair. They weren't dressed nearly as neatly as they had in the 50s. Drug use was a lot more common. They also believed in communal living. And whereas today we mostly live with our immediate families, mom, dad, brothers, and sisters, communal living is where many families live together and work together as one. More like on a farm, everybody's going to pitch in and help out. Rather than prescribing to Christianity, the hippie generation explored Eastern religions as an alternative to Christianity. So all of these things coupled together are going to make the hippie generation stand out. Unfortunately for the counterculture, it does eventually turn violent. Some of the realities that come along with these ideal living situations just don't work out. Drug use, for example. Drugs are very expensive in reality, and they did not have the money to pay for them, so oftentimes they would turn to crime. These are going to cause many problems as we continue on throughout the 1960s into the 70s. The hippie generation definitely left its influence. We see it in pop art. Andy Warhol. He's the one that had the Marilyn Monroe pictures, and they're all in different bright colors. We see it in fashion trends, things like bell bottoms, okay, fringe on their clothing, things like this that actually have kind of made a comeback. Rock music. The Beatles are often known as the British invasion. And what we've already heard when we studied Vietnam was that music was often used as a form of protest. We see much of this music played at Woodstock. This was a 3-day music festival held in 1969 in New York. This was also a period where ideas regarding sexual relationships are going to change. Rather than being monogamous or between two people, we're going to see much more casual attitudes. The idea is that monogamy was not necessary in order to engage in a sexual relationship. Obviously, this is going to have a big conservative backlash. Those who believe that this was just morally wrong, those who did not understand this type of lifestyle, are definitely going to begin criticizing this generation for that type of attitude. The women's movement is really going to take off in the 1960s as well. Feminism is nothing more than the belief that men and women should be equal. So if you believe that men and women should be equal, then you could call yourself a feminist. With more women in the workforce, women began exploring new ways that they could fulfill their lives. And Betty Friedan, in her book, The Feminine Mystique, is going to encourage finding that fulfillment and to look for true happiness, which wherever that might be. This definitely sparks the women's liberation movement in the 1960s and beyond. We see several organizations founded. NOW, for example, it stands for the National Organization for Women. They're going to continue fighting for women's rights. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is going to fight to try to help men and women get equal pay. This is also something that continues to be a struggle in the workforce, as even today, women are still paid around 80 cents on the dollar to what a man would do for the same job. Gloria Steinem was a big proponent in passing and getting Miss Magazine founded that was centered around women's issues. Roe v. Wade is the court case that makes abortion legal. Before 1973, even though abortions were not legal, this did not mean that women were not having abortions. Women were going to unlicensed doctors in unofficial situations to have abortions performed that were often dangerous and sometimes fatal. The idea behind making abortion legal was that so the federal government could regulate it, making this a safe procedure for women to have. There are various limits on abortion that continue to be debated about even in our political circles today. The ERA stands for the Equal Rights Amendment. This amendment called for there to be no discrimination based on gender. Unfortunately, this ERA was never ratified, and in fact was even voted down several times in Congress. We'll talk more about it when we get to the 1980s, because that's when it really had a real shot at being ratified, but was never actually ratified. And we'll find out that it was a surprising group of people that actually got it voted down. As the Latino population continues to grow in the United States, there was a bigger push for there to be more Latino civil rights. Many of these Latinos lived in segregated communities called barrios. They faced a lot of discrimination and a high level of poverty in regards to the rest of the country. Cesar Chavez, who was a major proponent for the Latino rights movement, who was also the leader of the United Farm Workers, is going to push for civil rights for Latino Americans. Mainly, the things they were looking for was better education and political power. In increasing both of these, it would allow them to gain their civil rights. Native Americans, who had always had a raw deal in U.S. history and had always been given unfair treatment by the American government, began pushing for to have all of those wrongs righted. The American Indian movement, often called AIM, wanted faster changes and wanted to reform American Indian policy. They were also protesting all of the many, many, many broken treaties that were made with the U.S. government. In their various protests, they were able to win back some of their tribal lands, and they were also given greater control over their own Indian affairs. This is why you see on reservations today that they still have control over those areas where the federal government does not. So we finally start to see some of our Indian policy try to be corrected from all of the many generations of the wrongs that were done to them